Today, I'm going to cover 3 stories that all became hugely famous as fiction. However, what most people don't know is they're actually based on real-life events. And these real stories are wild. And those are what I'm sharing with you today. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and replace their dish soap with cooking oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One night in May of 1896, a young opera singer sat inside of her dressing room at the Palais Garnier, which is this huge, beautiful theater in Paris, France. A little while earlier, she'd finished a performance of a very famous opera, and now she was getting changed and taking off her makeup. However, as she was doing this, she suddenly heard the sound in the theater that immediately sent goosebumps up and down her body. It sounded like a man was singing somewhere out there. And his voice was very deep and very sad. And really, it wasn't so much the sound of the voice that was so unsettling. It was just the fact that she was hearing anybody in the theater at all. I mean, she should have been alone in the theater. As far as she knew, all of the other performers and crew members had already gone home. So who was this? And so she left her room and she stepped out into the hallway and just began looking around, thinking maybe one of the other opera singers had maybe stayed behind without her knowing. But she didn't see anybody else backstage. And as she listened carefully to, again, this man who was still singing somewhere in the theater, she realized that the voice was actually coming from below her. And this revelation made her go from just being unsettled to being genuinely scared. So before she had ever worked in this theater, she'd actually heard a rumor about this theater. It was said that for the past several years, a man had been secretly living inside of this theater. And apparently, the same man had been horribly injured in a fire at a different theater that was nearby. And now he was, too scared to show his face in public. So he squatted in the basement and the walls of the Palais Garnier and only ever came out at night when he believed he was alone. Now, this woman, this young opera singer, had always assumed that, this was just obviously some legend made up to scare people or maybe even to entice people to come to this theater. But now, standing in the hallway and clearly hearing this strange, sad voice echoing up from beneath her feet, she really couldn't help but feel like maybe this story is true, and how terrifying a thought that was. However, as she stood there listening to this voice, she sort of slowly began to convince herself that maybe it actually wasn't a man's voice. Maybe this was the sound of water moving through the pipes or something like that. I mean, to be honest, the sound was sort of far away. And she's thinking, maybe I'm convincing myself this is an actual person's voice. Maybe it's not. And so she's sitting there listening, and sure enough, after a couple of minutes, she really had convinced herself that, no, this is not a person. This is just like late night sounds the theater makes, and I'm not really here a lot by myself, and I've never heard this before, so this is nothing. And so she quickly, because she told herself she was convinced of this, but deep down she wasn't, but she quickly went back into her dressing room, she gathered up her things, and she left for the night. A few days later, on the evening of May 20th, that same young opera singer was waiting in the wings just off stage. She and the rest of the cast were in the middle of a performance, and she was waiting for her cue to go on stage. But as she was watching the show from backstage, she suddenly saw movement above the stage, way up in the rafters. And she looked up and she saw there was a man in dark clothes who was up there. Now, at first, she thought, maybe this man is a stagehand. But as she continued to look at him, she realized he wasn't doing anything. He was just crouched up there, sort of hiding from everybody else, just sort of staring down at the performance, like he was watching the performance. But then, as this young opera singer is staring up at this guy, he suddenly turned and looked right at her. And this young singer, she had to hold back a gasp because this man's face was obviously just totally disfigured by what appeared to be burn scars. And so terrified, this woman turns, she rushes and grabs a crew member, and she points up into the rafters and says there's somebody up there. But when they both looked up again, the man in dark clothes with the burned face was gone. Now, the young singer, she felt certain that what she had seen just moments before was real. But the crew member was looking at her like, are you sure you saw that? Like, this seems pretty far-fetched. Like, why would anyone be up there? Certainly not some random person. Like, what are you talking about? And so she didn't know what to do, but the show she was in had to go on. About an hour later, the young singer was standing on stage and bowing in front of a crowd of nearly 2,000 people. She and the rest of the cast had just finished performing Act 1, and the young singer had barely made it through the performance because she was still so shaken up by what she had seen backstage, up in the rafters. All she wanted to do was get off stage and spend intermission calming down. But now, even though it was only the end of Act 1, the crowd was so excited and they loved the performance. She had just done so much. They were calling for her, specifically her, to do an encore of her last aria. The singer knew she didn't really have a choice. So she nodded to the conductor and then reluctantly stepped forward and restarted the piece. And as she sang, her anxiety actually began to melt away. She let herself get lost in the music, she closed her eyes, and she belted a high note. But suddenly, she heard this ear-splitting bang. And she opened her eyes just in time to see a brief flash of light. Then she watched in horror as the giant glass chandelier that hung above the audience came crashing down and landed directly on top of a woman, killing her instantly. Police immediately launched an investigation into the falling chandelier, but quickly determined that the whole thing was really just a freak accident. They said that one of the chandelier's candles had caused a small fire, which had melted the cord that held it up and caused it to fall. But the young singer, she didn't believe this, because she'd seen that burned man in the rafters just, less than an hour before the disaster, and she couldn't help but feel like he was to blame. And her theory, as wild as it sounded, actually gained traction. Eventually, a journalist named Gaston Leroux heard about it and started his own investigation. He spent weeks searching for the burned man, even showing up unannounced at the theater at different times of day and night to try to catch him. But he never did. However, Gaston did track down some construction workers who had helped build the theater 20 years earlier, and they claimed they knew exactly who the burned man was. So before the Palais Garnier was built, there had been another theater right down the block. But that theater had been completely destroyed by a fire 20 years earlier in 1873. On the night of that fire, a young pianist named Ernest had been inside the building, working on a wedding march for his fiancée, who was a ballerina at the theater. Out of nowhere, he began to smell smoke, and then before he knew it, flames blocked his only way out. He had no choice but to run through the flames, and by doing that, he suffered terrible facial injuries, but he would survive. Unfortunately, though, his fiancée did not make it out. She died in the fire. The construction workers told Gaston that after this horrible tragedy, Ernest had sort of removed himself from society. Like, not only did the burns make it difficult for him to be in public, he was, self-conscious, but also he was racked with grief about losing his fiancée. And so they said Ernest had taken refuge in the basement of the Palais Garnier, which at this point was just under construction. And the construction workers said they heard Ernest playing the piano at all hours in this basement, obsessively trying to finish that wedding march for his fiancée. And often while he was doing this, he was screaming and crying out in agony. Now, the workers told Gaston that eventually they stopped hearing Ernest, and they assumed at that point he had left, or maybe even died. Or they said, it's possible they never heard him at all, and they had convinced themselves that they were hearing him down there. They didn't know. But then, after that, performers at the now finished Palais Garnier reported hearing this sad voice singing after hours in the building. And some even reported seeing a scarred man, the scars on his face, creeping around the dark corners of the theater. But when these people would periodically investigate to see where it was coming from and who is that, nobody was ever there. And so after hearing this story from these construction workers, Gaston Leroux, the journalist, was, sort of conflicted in a way. On the one hand, he was sort of disturbed by, these two tragedies separated by 20 years. You have the fire that claimed the life of Ernest's fiance and, apparently badly hurt Ernest. And then you have this chandelier falling and killing a guest at the theater at the Palais Garnier 20 years later. So that was horrible. That was tragic. But more than that, the feeling that Gaston had was that he felt sort of deeply moved by the story of Ernest's love for his fiancée. Whether or not the story was even true, whether or not he really did go into the basement as construction was being done and, try to finish that song for his dead fiancée. It didn't really matter. It was like that combined with these rumors of there being, this ghost in the theater. It was just kind of moving. The idea that, poor Ernest and his fiancée, that's what stuck out to the journalist. And so ultimately, Gaston ended up writing a book about this story, and the book was then adapted into one of the most famous musicals of all time. Today, Ernest is more often known by the nickname that Gaston Leroux gave him, the Phantom of the Opera. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On September 29, 1939, a British intelligence agent walked through the door of the Royal Navy headquarters in London with an envelope tucked under his arm. When he stepped inside, a doorman stopped him and asked to see his pass. The agent flashed a badge that identified himself by the code name 17F, and the doorman simply nodded and let him through. Agent 17F then continued farther into the building, and he went down this long, silent white hallway to a black door with the number 39 painted on it. After looking around to make sure nobody was watching him, he reached down and he turned the handle and pushed the door open. And right away, he was hit by this brightly lit office, and inside it was absolutely chaotic. The air was full of smoke from tobacco, telephones were ringing off the hook, typewriters were clattering away, and men in dark suits were rushing back and forth. This was the office of Great Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and World War II had just broken out just a few weeks ago, so everything was nuts. The spies that worked in this office were literally out gathering intel and analyzing data and also coming up with creative, sort of crazy ways to literally trick the enemy. Now, Agent 17F was not actually an intelligence agent. He was the director's personal assistant, so he had no spy training. But he was very creative and had a way of coming up with schemes that were so crazy they just might work. And that really was a skill the department desperately needed right now. The director was really practical and analytical and pragmatic, and so he sort of liked having someone around in his personal assistant, 17F, whose thought patterns were just much more colorful. I mean, he really thought differently than the director. So Agent 17F very casually walked into this chaotic room, and he strolled across the floor, and he reached the director's door, and he knocked. And a moment later, the director called for him to come in, and 17F walked inside, walked right over to the desk where the director was sitting, and he dropped that envelope he was carrying right on the desk. And the director picked it up, he opened the envelope, and started reading what was inside. And as the director's eyes scanned the page, Agent 17F couldn't help but see what looked like an annoyed look come across the director's face. So inside the envelope was a list of ideas that 17F had come up with for spreading misinformation to the Germans. Basically, they were ways to confuse and misdirect the German military by giving them fake information about what the British were up to. Now, this is a very normal thing that virtually every military does during a time of war. But these specific strategies that Agent 17F had come up with on this list were really out there. I mean, even for his own standards, these were sort of wild. For example, on this list, there was included this idea to have the British drop soccer balls covered in reflective paint into the ocean so that enemy submarines would, mistake them for explosives. There was another suggestion to put fake intelligence messages into literal bottles and just set them loose at sea and hope Germans found them. 17F also said he wanted to mail out fake copies of the Times newspaper with made-up news stories and made-up headlines to, again, sort of trick their enemy. And so Agent 17F had been pretty excited to share this list with the director. I mean, he was proud of these ideas. But now, looking at the director, it seemed like he was just getting really frustrated. And so 17F wondered if maybe he had pushed it too far. But just then, the director stopped and clearly was fixated on one particular idea on this list. And he looked up at 17F and he said, actually, this one seems workable. So the idea that the director liked was actually based on something that happened in a crime novel that Agent 17F had read. Agent 17F was suggesting that they borrow a corpse from the naval hospital, dress it in a British pilot's uniform, and put fake dispatches in its pockets with details of a supposed military operation. They then put a faulty parachute on the corpse's back and fly over the German coast and drop the corpse out onto the beach. And when the Germans found the corpse, the idea was that they would obviously assumed that this was an actual pilot who had died when his parachute failed. And then if they believed that, well, they'd very likely believe that the information the British agents planted in the corpse's pockets were actual military secrets that they'd intercepted. And so in the end, the director told Agent 17F that, you know what, this is actually pretty good. You did a good job after all. And so by the time Agent 17F left the director's office and walked over to his own desk in the corner, he was feeling proud that at least one of his big swings had potentially landed. 4 years later, at a pivotal moment in World War II, the British put a version of 17F's plan into action. They called it Operation Mincemeat, and amazingly, it worked. British spies did plant a corpse out on the beach with the faulty parachute, with documents in its pockets saying that the Allied powers of America and Britain were going to invade Greece and Sardinia, which prompted the Germans to move a ton of their troops away from the Allies' real target, which was the island of Sicily. Sicily is part of Italy, and Italy was allied with Germany during World War II. And so thanks in part to Operation Mincemeat, 17F's big idea, the Germans were totally caught off guard by the invasion of Sicily, and the Allies captured the entire island. This then paved the way for an invasion of mainland Italy, which was a major turning point in the war. And again, it was all because of this one idea inspired by Agent 17F. Now, to be clear, Agent 17F was not personally there for the invasion, and he didn't publicly get credit for his role in planning it, even though Operation Mincemeat would become pretty famous. But anonymity was super important for anyone working in intelligence, which 17F was. And when the war ended, 17F might have stayed a ghost forever. But one slow afternoon at the end of the war, when the chaos in Room 39 had died down and there were only a couple dozen people still working out of that office, Agent 17F was sitting at his desk in the corner, and the other agents nearby were talking to each other about what they were going to do next. And Agent 17F, even though he wasn't a part of their conversation, internally he sort of asked himself the same question, like, what am I going to do next? I mean, he was so good at coming up with these wild ideas, and he really had so much fun doing it. Like, how could he just stop doing that and go have a normal job? Like, this was his calling. Doing what he did now is the only thing he wanted to do. But then he realized as he was sitting there that maybe he didn't have to stop doing this. After the war, for years, Agent 17F kept on coming up with fantastical spy ideas. But this time, instead of giving these ideas to the government, he wrote them all down with the intention of someday making a book around these ideas. And finally, in 1953, he published the first book under his real name, Ian Fleming. And his book was wildly successful, and he went on to write more books all about this same character who was a spy. And that spy's name was James Bond. One fall afternoon in 1830, a beaver trapper named Smith and his hunting partner, whose name was Bauman, hiked through the Bitterroot Mountains, which is a section of the Rocky Mountains in southwestern Montana. Now, where they were headed was this remote pond deep in the woods that was rumored to be full of beavers. However, despite that, nobody really ever dared to go there, because the area was also said to be cursed. Now, the reasoning behind, this rumor, the cursed rumor, is that about a year ago, a hunter had traveled to the pond on his own and he'd never come back home. And eventually miners had passed through that area and they found his body, and his body had basically been torn to shreds and actually partially eaten. And so naturally, rumors had begun to spread that, this pond was home to some kind of man-eating monster. But Smith and Bauman, they didn't believe in curses or monsters. They believed in money. And they knew that they'd make a lot of money from all the beavers they would catch at this pond. And so after several hours of hiking through the forest, Smith and Bauman did finally arrive at this cursed pond, and they hurried to set up their camp. They gathered firewood and they built a lean-to where they would stay for the next few nights. And then after that, they set up a few beaver traps around the pond and then followed this nearby stream several miles uphill and set up beaver traps along the way. And so when they were done setting all these traps, it was around sunset, Smith and Bauman decided to head back to their camp, the lean-to they had set up, and make some dinner and then go to bed. And so down the hill they went, and they're getting closer and closer to their campsite. And keep in mind, there's nobody else out here. They are in the middle of the forest. And as they're approaching their campsite, when they got within range and could actually see it, they just stopped. Because their lean-to they had put together as soon as they got there, their lean-to and all their gear had basically been torn to shreds. It's like their campsite had a tornado come through it, and everything was just kind of all over the place. And there was no people, no animals, no nothing. It was like something had happened while they were up the hill setting up these traps. Now, Smith and Bauman, their reaction was not, oh my goodness, like a monster came through here. They're like, great, a bear must have come through, because bears were in this area. So this is like a nuisance at this point. This is not confirmation that the pond is haunted and that there's a monster here. They're just like, great, we gotta reset up our camp now. So the two men walked over to their destroyed campsite and began rebuilding it. But as they were, putting their lean-to back together and, packaging up their gear back into their bags, something really stood out that was pretty odd. So they're thinking that a bear must have come through here. And why would a bear come through here? Why would a bear tear all this stuff apart? Well, because the bear would be looking for food, as bears are known to do. But as they're packaging things up, both Smith and Bauman are seeing that none of their food was taken. Like, no food has been taken, and quite a bit of it was out in the open. So there certainly was opportunity, but it wasn't. And so they're thinking, that's so weird. Like, clearly a big effort was made to look through the campsite for something. It wasn't like an animal came over and just batted it around and then left. There had to be a reason. Like, what were they looking for? Like, what's going on here? That's so odd. But both men figured that what likely had happened here was, as they were coming back down the hill, this bear must have heard them and ran off before taking their food. And so ultimately they felt like they had just gotten really lucky here. And so Bauman went to go start a campfire to make their dinner, and Smith finished putting back together their lean-to camp. But just a little while later, as Smith reconstructed their lean-to, he couldn't shake the feeling that there really was something odd about whatever had happened here. They had this explanation that maybe they got lucky, but It just felt sort of weird, especially considering that there was lots of lore about this place being kind of dangerous to people. Forget whether it's a curse or a monster. There was just a fear that something odd was going on here. And so Smith, he said to Bauman, hey, I'm just gonna, for my own sanity here, look around and just look for tracks. Let's confirm that this really was a bear. And so, Bauman's like, great, go for it. He's, setting up the fire. And Smith, began walking away from the campsite looking for tracks. However, after stepping just a few feet away from, the campfire and their campsite, Smith realized it was just too dark out to actually see anything on the ground. So he went back to the campsite, he grabbed a torch, and he lit it in the fire that Bauman had made. And then now, with this light source, he left the campsite and began scanning the ground, looking for, the tracks from this bear. And at first, he didn't see anything. There were no tracks. It was just, some broken leaves, and there were some broken sticks and some, brush that had been sort of trampled over that suggested an animal had come through here. But again, there were no tracks. And so he's walking farther and farther away from their campsite until he gets to this clearing that was actually not very far from their campsite. But in this clearing, he found some tracks. There were these massive paw prints that were in the ground, tracks from this animal with huge claws, like massive, massive paws that certainly suggested this was a bear. And in a way, this was sort of reassuring for Smith, because ultimately he was going out here to confirm that this was a bear, right? This wasn't anything else, this was a bear. But as he's looking at these tracks and watching them sort of meander their way through this clearing and, back off into the woods, he noticed something strange about these tracks. Yes, they were paw prints that certainly suggested they were a bear. But the way they were landing in the ground suggested it was just 2 paws, not 4. And a bear walks on all 4. Whatever creature was leaving behind these prints was walking on 2 legs. Bears don't do that. And so Smith couldn't help but feel like a little unnerved. I mean, he's seeing clear as day prints of a bipedal creature with huge paws, huge claws, walking around near their campsite. I mean, what did this? Is this a bear? He knew bears could get up on their hind legs, but they don't walk very far on just their hind legs. And so this was unsettling. And again, as much as he wasn't scared of, the curse or monsters that were out here, it was hard not to think, like, is there truth to that stuff? And so Smith, sort of rattled, he turns around and hustles back to the campsite, and he tells Bauman, I found tracks, and I think it's bear tracks. But whatever it is walking around on 2 legs. Like, I'm telling you, it's 2 legs. There's no 4-legged creature walking around. And Bauman laughed. He actually thought that Smith was just like playing a joke on him, like, you're trying to scare me out here, right? But Smith is like, I'm not joking. Like, I'm telling you, the tracks 100% are of an animal walking around on 2 legs. And it appears to be an enormous bear, And, Bauman at this point, he's like, well, bears can walk on their hind legs, but both of them are like, yeah, but again, not for long periods of time. And so the 2 men really didn't know what to make of this. I mean, by this point, their campsite was set back up, they had their fire, their things are sort of back to normal, and they're not hearing any animals or anything odd in the vicinity. And so pretty quickly, they both were like, well, I guess that was just a standing bear. Hopefully it doesn't come back. And they just sat down by the fire and ate their dinner. So after dinner, the 2 men eventually did decide to just go to sleep. They were sort of in denial about the weirdness that was going on at their campsite, but they had both sort of, without saying anything, elected to just not talk about it and just bury those feelings and just ignore this gut instinct, this almost primal instinct that something was off here. And so the 2 men, they climbed into their lean-to tent together, and they lied down next to each other, and eventually they drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, when Smith and Bauman were both fast asleep inside of this lean-to right next to each other, there was this loud, almost moaning sound coming from somewhere in the forest. And it was loud enough that it woke both Smith and Bauman up. And so they sit up inside of their lean-to. It's dark, but they can basically see each other. And they're sort of saying to each other, like, hey, did you hear that? Like, what was that? Neither of them knew, but now they're sort of on edge, and they're sitting in their lean-to, obviously thinking about the fact that, this bear or whatever it was had clearly come through here the day before. They're hoping it's not coming back, and they're sitting there listening really intently to the noises coming from the forest. And there are regular night noises, all across the forest, bugs and birds and animals, that kind of thing. But as they're straining to listen, they can hear something huge is making its way through the tree line in their direction. And so Bauman sort of reflexively grabbed his rifle, and he's just holding onto his rifle, wondering what he's gonna do. And Smith too is sort of not sure what to do. And then at some point, as whatever this is got close enough to their lean-to, they can't see it. They're too scared to poke their head out to look, but they know it's getting closer. When it got close enough, they began to smell whatever it was. It was like this musty earth smell. And as the two men are getting ready to actually make a plan about what to do, obviously this thing is back, whatever it is, they hear the noise again that woke them up. But now it's literally coming from right outside of their lean-to. And it's this guttural, loud, almost like human moaning sound, but it's definitely not a person. It's just this eerie, low rumbling sound, and it's right outside the tent. And Bauman, as soon as he heard this, he just turned and he aimed his rifle and fired basically roughly in the direction of where this thing was, which again is right outside their lean-to. And as soon as he fired, both men heard the sound of this huge creature right outside their lean-to turn and start running into the forest, just bounding through the trees. Trees are crashing. It's this totally chaotic sound as this huge thing is retreating into the woods. And then at some point, all the noise stops and they don't hear it again. And the two men are so frightened by whatever this was. It certainly didn't feel like a bear. They had not smelled something like that. They had certainly not heard a sound like that. And just the way it was moving, it was so agile and so huge and did sound like something that was walking sort of upright. Even just the steps it was taking right outside their lean-to, it didn't sound like a typical animal moving around. This was different. And so the two men, they're terrified, and they're just up all night, waiting for this thing to come back. By the time the sun finally rose the next morning, Smith was so anxious and so exhausted that he actually felt sick. He didn't want to leave the campsite because this trip was ultimately about making money, and they had not caught any beavers yet, so this was not a profitable trip yet. But if they left now, they definitely wouldn't be catching anything, and this really would be a net loss. However, both he and Bauman both agreed that, whatever kind of creature here kept coming back to their campsite, it certainly did not act, walk, or sound like a bear. Whatever it was, clearly it was dangerous. So ultimately, what Bauman and Smith decide to do is they are going to basically wrap up this trip early, but first, they're going to go check all those beaver traps they had set, both around the pond and up the hill next to that stream. But normally they would do this together, and it would take a really long time to go to each and every trap and check it, and if there was a beaver in there to work through that. So what they decided to do instead, in order to be expeditious and be really quick, is they would split up. It's broad daylight. They figured they were safe here from whatever this creature was, and they would split up, they would divide and conquer, check all the traps, and then meet back at the campsite before it was dark, pack up, and leave. A little while later, Bauman had finished checking all the traps that he was responsible for, and he had come back with 3 beavers over his shoulder, and he was feeling pretty good. He was pretty quick checking his traps. He's thinking, great, our plan's gonna work. I bet Smith is done too. We can pack up and get out of here, hopefully really soon. And so he's walking towards the campsite, and he can see it up ahead. And at first glance, everything looked to be in normal order. The lean-to was still set up, and he could see there was some gear stacked up on the ground. And so as Bauman got closer to the camp, he began calling out to his friend, to Smith. And Smith didn't call back. Now, Bauman didn't really know if Smith was actually back to the campsite yet. He could still be out checking his traps. So Bauman, he walks into the campsite, and Smith is not there. But that gear that he saw from a distance sort of stacked up in the middle of the campsite, well, it was Smith's gear, and he had packed it all up and stacked it there, which certainly suggested that Smith had finished checking his traps, had packed his stuff, and had to be nearby, like he was getting ready to leave too. And so Bauman's thinking, okay, I just gotta find him. Maybe he walked off somewhere as he's waiting for me. And so Bauman, he puts his beavers down and continues calling out for Smith, just sort of wandering around, the rough vicinity of the campsite, hoping to find Smith. But Smith never calls back. And Bauman's getting a little worried. Again, they're obviously on edge here. Some weird things have been happening here. That creature obviously totally freaked them out. And so, Bauman is yelling louder and louder, and he's sort of moving faster and faster, trying to find some sign of where Smith went. And at some point, Bauman makes his way into that clearing where the night before, Smith had actually found those tracks that showed, this bipedal creature moving around. And when Bauman made his way into that clearing, he just stopped. Because the first thing he saw is there was blood all over this clearing. It was like a bloodbath everywhere. And then on the other side of the clearing, sort of draped up against this tree, was like this heap of meat. That heap of meat was Smith. Smith had been absolutely ripped to shreds. Like his body was just destroyed. His limbs were all in different directions. Like he was ripped to pieces. And Bauman, he didn't even have to go over to check to see if he was dead. He was definitely dead. There's no creature in the area. It's totally silent, eerily silent. And Bauman, he's just staring at his friend, wondering, what does he even do? But as he's standing there staring at this just horrific scene, something else clicked. If it had been an animal that attacked his friend Smith, if an animal was responsible for this, it likely would have eaten Smith, or there would have been signs that Smith was eaten by this animal. But Smith had no signs of predation. Smith had no signs that an animal was trying to eat him. His whole body was just ripped apart, like whatever killed him just wanted to kill him and basically fling him around like a toy as he was being killed. And so at this point, almost like instinctively, Bauman knew two things. One, the creature clearly killed Smith. There was no other explanation that made sense here. He didn't understand, why or even how, but the creature had to have done this. And two, the creature was not a bear. Couldn't have been a bear. There's too many obvious signs that what they're dealing with here is not a bear or really any animal he had ever run into. And then also, sort of a third thing was, Bauman's thinking, I wasn't that far away. Like this horrifically violent attack, it sort of happened silently or just fast enough that, Smith didn't have time to scream. It's like this creature killed almost surgically, despite the sort of gratuitous nature of the scene. And so all that said to Bauman is he needed to leave right now. And so he literally left his friend, he left all the supplies, he just turned and fled. Over the next several decades, Bauman just lied about what happened to Smith. He told people that while they were out there, Smith was attacked and killed by a bear. And the reason he did that and did not tell people that, well, it was some bipedal monster that, wandered the woods and slaughtered my friend, the reason he didn't say that is because he felt like nobody would believe him, that he would look crazy. And that, of course, he's feeding into this rumor that this particular area is cursed and there's a monster out there. He just didn't think people would take him seriously, so he kept it to himself. That was until about 40 years later when Bauman met this man that he felt like he could trust with his real story. This man was an avid hunter, and he was collecting unique stories for a book he was writing about wilderness exploration. And to Bauman, it felt like his story was a fit. So Bauman told him the truth. He told him all about, what they experienced out there and, the fact that he did not believe it was a bear. He felt like it was a monster, if you will. And this man who's hearing this story took Bauman really seriously. He took detailed notes as Bauman was recounting this, horrific thing, and then he ultimately published Bauman's account in his book. In the book, the writer described this creature that Bauman and Smith encountered in the woods as, quote, something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast. Now, to modern audiences, when you hear the details of the story, the one I've just shared with you, the monster really sounds an awful lot like Bigfoot, or at least something Bigfoot adjacent. But the writer published this book, published Bauman's account, in 1893, which was more than 60 years before the term Bigfoot even existed. So today, Bigfoot believers cite this book, in particular Bauman's Experience, as one of the very first documented accounts ever of a monster that is now ubiquitous. But the writer of this book did not go down in history as, being remembered for documenting Bigfoot essentially for the first time, or at least before anybody knew, what Bigfoot was. No. Instead, the writer would go down in history for what he did 8 years after publishing that book. That was when he was elected as America's 26th president. The writer was Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In June of 1977, 6-year-old Renee Freer lived with her parents and her older siblings in a ranch-style house in a subdivision in Monroe, Connecticut. The road her family lived on was a dead-end loop, only about 30 homes in total, and the back of every property bumped up against thick Connecticut woods that ran for miles. Everyone in the subdivision called Renee by her nickname, Giggles. She had a laugh that you could hear 2 yards over, the kind of laugh adults remembered for decades afterward. She was small for her age with light brown hair, and she was the kind of kid who would knock on a neighbor's screen door and just walk in because that's how the whole neighborhood worked. The kids on that road basically lived outside. They built forts in the woods out of fallen branches. They rode their bikes in long, slow circles around the cul-de-sac. They walked into each other's kitchens for popsicles. The parents on that street knew every single child by name, and they all watched each other's kids without thinking twice about it. Nobody locked their doors during the day. On this particular afternoon in late June, Renee was inside the house with her mother. It was hot, the screen door was open. Somewhere out in the cul-de-sac, kids were yelling. Renee finished whatever she was doing in the living room, walked over to her mom, and asked if she could go out and play. Her mother said yes, the way she had said yes 100 times before. So Renee pushed the screen door open and stepped outside. She walked down the front steps and out into the yard. Her mother could hear her on the porch for a moment, and then the sound of her bare feet on the grass, and then nothing in particular, which was normal because the sound of one kid moving through a yard full of other kids gets absorbed into everything else. Now, somewhere on that road that afternoon, parked along the curb, there was a vehicle that didn't belong to anybody in the subdivision. A couple of the older kids noticed it. One of them later said he thought it was a contractor's truck. They were building a new house at the bottom of the loop that summer, and trucks came and went all the time. Nobody thought twice about it. About an hour later, Renee's mother walked back into the kitchen and started getting things together for dinner. She glanced out at the yard. She didn't see Renee, but she didn't expect to. Renee could be anywhere on that street. She could be at the Henderson's house. She could be at the playset 2 doors down. She could be in someone's basement watching cartoons. Renee's mother stepped out onto the porch and called her daughter's name once. She waited. Nothing came back. So she called it again, louder, this time the way mothers in that neighborhood had been calling kids in for dinner for years. The other kids on the street heard her. A couple of them stopped what they were doing and looked up the road, but there was no answer. That was when she started walking, first to the Hendersons, then to the next house, then to the next. By the time she had checked 5 front doors, 2 of the neighbor moms were walking with her. By the time she had checked 10, the men in the neighborhood were coming out of their garages. The sun was still high. Nobody was panicking yet. They were just looking. 40 minutes in, every father on the road was in the woods behind the houses with a flashlight, even though it was still bright outside. They were calling her name. Giggles, Renee, Honey. The kids who built forts back there knew every trail. They were leading the search. The Connecticut woods in late June are dense, full of green leaves and ferns and the kind of shadow that swallows sound. Renee's mother went back inside and picked up the phone and called the police. The dispatcher in Monroe took the call. The officer on duty was at the subdivision within minutes because the town was small and the road wasn't far from the station. By the time the first cruiser pulled up, half the neighborhood was outside, and the other half was still moving through the trees. A state trooper came in not long after. The search expanded. They were not yet treating it as a worst-case situation. Kids wandered, kids hid, kids fell asleep in basements. The trooper kept telling the parents that 90% of the time, the child is within a quarter-mile of the house. That was true. He had said it before in other towns. He had been right every other time. The woods behind the subdivision were full of small clearings where the kids built things over the course of the summer. Forts, hideouts, tepees made of dead branches leaned against tree trunks. The neighborhood dads knew where some of these were because they had helped build them, or because their own kids had dragged them out to show off the construction. The trooper was moving through one of these clearings when he found the fort. It was a small one, just branches stacked against a tree with a kind of crawl space underneath. The kind of thing a 6-year-old could fit inside. He knelt down. He looked behind it. Renee was there. The trooper keyed his radio. His voice was steady, the way a trooper's voice has to be. He gave the location. He gave the situation. Up at the road, Renee's mother was standing on her own front lawn with 2 of the neighbor women holding onto her arms. And one of the deputies who had just arrived at the scene heard the call come in and turned his back to the women. So they couldn't see his face. The woods went quiet, not all at once, in waves. The men with flashlights were spread out across maybe 40 acres at that point. The news traveled through them in whispers, neighbor to neighbor, father to father. The flashlights stopped moving. The voices stopped calling her name, and then it was just the sound of insects and the wind in the leaves, the way the woods always sound when nobody is moving. She had been struck in the head. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death to be blunt force trauma. There were no signs of a long struggle. There were no signs that she had been dragged any great distance. The fort she was found behind was less than a 5-minute walk from her own back porch. The investigation started inside that hour. By the next morning, every house in the subdivision had a detective at the door. The state police came in, the Monroe police set up a command post, the FBI consulted. Investigators built a 5 3-page case file that would eventually grow and grow over the decades, and they did what investigators always do in these situations. They started with the simplest theory. The simplest theory was a stranger, a drifter, someone passing through on the highway that ran a few miles away who had pulled off, walked into the woods, encountered Renee, and disappeared. That theory had the advantage of being comforting. It meant that the killer was no longer in the neighborhood. It meant the neighborhood was safe again. But the deeper investigators looked, the less that theory held. The brush leading into the clearing was undisturbed in the directions you would expect a stranger to come from. There were no tire tracks on the access road behind the woods. There were no reports from any neighboring street of an unfamiliar vehicle moving through the area that afternoon, except for the one parked truck that several kids had noticed, which turned out to belong to a contractor with a clean alibi. And there was the timing. Renee had been outside for less than 20 minutes when her mother first looked for her. 20 minutes. To get a small child off a front lawn into the woods to that particular clearing behind that particular fort without being seen by any of the other kids on the street and without leaving a trail, you would need to know the layout. You would need to know which paths the kids used and which ones they didn't. You would need to know where to step. A stranger doesn't know that. A stranger from the highway has never been in those woods. The detective stood in that clearing the next morning and looked back through the trees toward the houses, and they could see roofs and porches and laundry on lines, and they understood very quickly that whoever had done this had done it. From inside the neighborhood, not from outside of it. The pool of suspects was 30 houses wide. That was the entire pool. Every adult man on that road was interviewed. Every contractor who had worked on the new build was interviewed. Every relative who had visited that weekend was interviewed. Polygraphs were offered. Some were taken. Some were refused. Detectives sat in living rooms across that subdivision drinking coffee that the suspects' wives had poured for them and asked careful questions. Nobody confessed. Nobody slipped. The neighborhood kept its mouth shut the way small neighborhoods sometimes do when the answer they're being asked to give would mean turning on someone they had a barbecue with the weekend before. Detectives left those living rooms with the strong feeling that they had just been in the same room as the killer, and they had no way to prove which chair he had been sitting in. The case did not get colder all at once. It got colder slowly. Months went by, then years. Detectives retired. The file moved from one desk to another. The neighborhood kids grew up and moved away. The contractor finished the new build at the bottom of the loop, and somebody else moved into it. The woods behind the houses kept doing what woods do, which is grow over everything. The forts collapsed, the trails closed in. Decades later, the Connecticut Cold Case Unit pulled the file off the shelf. They offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. They re-interviewed everyone they could still find. Some of the original suspects were dead by then. Some had moved across the country. Some still lived in the same houses on the same road with grandchildren of their own playing in the same backyards. No one came forward. To this day, the case of Renee Freer is officially open. The subdivision is still there. If you drive through it now, it looks like a perfectly ordinary New England neighborhood. 30 houses on a dead-end loop, trees in the back. A few of the families who lived there in 1977 are still on that street. The woods have grown back in over the spot where the fort used to be. The thing that investigators came to believe, the thing they would say off the record but never on the record, was that the killer didn't leave. The killer was at the search. The killer helped look. The killer carried a flashlight through those woods in the late afternoon and called Renee's name along with everyone else. The killer was at the funeral. The killer waved at Renee's mother for years afterward every time she pulled out of her driveway. That's where this case sits. A small girl, a screen door, an afternoon that was supposed to be like every other afternoon that summer. 30 houses, one killer, 50 years of silence. The file is still on a desk somewhere in Connecticut. The reward is still on the table. And whoever did it, if they're still alive, is now an old man sitting somewhere knowing. From a Connecticut cul-de-sac in the long heat of late June, we're going to move across the Atlantic now, north and east, to the west coast of Scotland in the cold gray of late autumn. From a 6-year-old at noon to a 22-year-old at a bus stop. From dense green woods to a slow gray river. And from a body that was found within an hour to a young woman whose body has never been found at all. It's Saturday morning, the 9th of October, 1976. The town of Saltcoats on the west coast of Scotland. A 22-year-old woman named Patricia Black finishes her tea, tells her family she's going into Irvine to do some shopping, and walks out the front door. She'll be home in a few hours, she says. Nothing about the morning feels different from any other Saturday morning. Patricia, who everyone in her life called Tricia, lived with her family in Saltcoats, a small coastal town on the Firth of Clyde. Saltcoats sits right on the water, the kind of place where the wind comes off the sea and finds you no matter what street you're standing on. In October, it's gray by 10 in the morning, the kind of gray that doesn't really lift all day. Tricia was 22, which in 1976 meant she had been making her own way around that part of Ayrshire since she was 14 or 15. She knew every bus route, she knew every shopkeeper, she knew the names of the conductors on the route between Saltcoats and Irvine because she had taken that bus 100 times before on 100 Saturday mornings just like this one. The plan that day was simple. Take the bus into Irvine, which was about 10 minutes away. Walk through the shops, maybe meet a friend, come home in time for supper. Her mother watched her button up her coat at the door, and there was a small moment where her mother said something about the weather being colder than it looked, and Tricia laughed and said she'd be fine. She left the house in the late morning, she caught the bus, she got off in Irvine, and for the next several hours, witnesses around the town center would later remember seeing her in different places, in a shop, on a corner, carrying a small handbag. Nothing about her movements that day suggested anything was wrong. She was a young woman doing exactly what she said she was going to do. The last confirmed sighting of Tricia Black came in the late afternoon. She was standing at a bus stop on the main road in Irvine, directly across the street from a place called the Turf Hotel. It was a busy spot. Cars going both ways. People coming in and out of the hotel, other people waiting at the same bus stop. She was waiting for the bus that would take her back home to Saltcoats. And then she wasn't there anymore. By that evening, when supper had come and gone and Tricia hadn't walked through the front door, her family started making phone calls. They called her friends. They called the houses of people she might have stopped to visit. They called the shops in Irvine. Nobody had seen her since the afternoon. By late that night, her father drove the route into Irvine himself, slowly looking at every bus stop along the way. The next morning, they went to the police. In a lot of missing persons cases, especially involving young women in 1976, the first reaction from the police was often a kind of soft dismissal. She'd turn up, she'd had a row with a boyfriend, she'd gone to stay with a friend. But the officers who took the report on Trisha Black didn't do that. There was something about the way she had vanished in the middle of a Saturday in the open in a town she knew that did not fit the usual pattern. Within 48 hours, this was not a missing persons case anymore. Strathclyde CID came in. The head of the homicide unit took it over personally. Detectives started canvassing every business near that bus stop, every passenger who might have been on the bus. She should have caught every car that had been parked along that stretch of road that afternoon. They were treating it as a homicide before they even had a body. Trisha had no enemies, she had no history of running off, she had no reason to disappear. Her room at her parents' house was exactly as she had left it that morning. Her clothes were still in the wardrobe. Her bank account was untouched. Whatever had happened to her had happened in the space between the bus stop and the bus in a window of probably less than 10 minutes somewhere across from the Turf Hotel. A week passed, then 2, then a month. There was no body. There was no witness who could place her getting into a specific car. The investigation kept going, but it was running into walls. And then, in the weeks after she disappeared, somebody on the team made the decision to send the police divers into the River Irvine. The River Irvine cuts through the town. It's not a wide river, but it's dark. The water moves slowly. The bottom is silt and stones. And visibility, once you're a foot under the surface, is essentially nothing. The divers worked the river in sections moving downstream from the area near where she was last seen, feeling along the riverbed with their hands because they couldn't really see anything in front of them. And in one of those sections, one of the divers' gloved hands closed around something that wasn't a stone. He brought it up. It was a leather handbag, wet, heavy, dark, with river water. The divers carried it to the bank and laid it out on a sheet of plastic. The first thing the detectives noticed was that the handbag had not simply fallen into the water. It hadn't been thrown. It hadn't drifted downstream. The handbag had been tied. There was twine wrapped around it. And inside the twine, weighing the whole thing down, were stones. Inside the handbag, they found her belongings. The detectives stood at the edge of the river. The water kept moving past them. Nobody said anything for a while. There was a sheet of plastic on the bank with a young woman's handbag laid out across it, dripping. There were divers in wetsuits sitting on the rocks. There were the lights of Irvine in the distance where Trisha had stood at a bus stop on a Saturday afternoon and never made it home. In any normal investigation, the working theory at that point would have been a robbery. Somebody had grabbed the bag, taken the cash, and dumped the rest. But that theory didn't survive contact with the evidence. The bag still had her things inside it. The bag had been deliberately weighted. Somebody had wrapped twine around it and tied stones into the twine. That isn't what a robber does. A robber drops the bag in a hedge and walks away. This was somebody who didn't want her found, and who wanted her belongings found even less. Somebody who had taken the time in the hours after Trisha disappeared to find twine, to find stones, to wrap the bag carefully, to come down to the river and to lower it into the water with the patience of a person who had thought it through. That is not the work of a panicked stranger. That is the work of somebody used to cleaning up. The investigation kept going for years. Detectives interviewed thousands of people. They worked through every man in Ayrshire with a criminal record that involved violence against women. They worked through everyone who had been in the Turf Hotel that afternoon. They worked through every car that had been spotted on that stretch of road. Nothing ever fully closed the loop. The case just kept sitting there year after year in the file room at Strathclyde. Then, slowly across the late 1970s and into the 1980s, detectives in Scotland started to notice a pattern. Young women in central Scotland and the surrounding regions were going missing or turning up dead in ways that had certain things in common. The victims were often bound, often with items of their own clothing. Often the bodies were left somewhere they were unlikely to be found. The man at the center of that pattern was named Angus Sinclair. Sinclair was not somebody Scottish police had to go looking for. He was already in custody for other things by the time detectives started piecing the pattern together. He had a long history of violence. He had been linked eventually to multiple murders, including ones that had gone unsolved for decades. His signature was specific. He bound his victims with their own clothing, he moved them, he hid the evidence carefully. And Sinclair, in the autumn of 1976, had been a regular in the exact area of Irvine where Tricia had disappeared. He drove through that part of the coast, he was known to the towns. He fit the pattern of the case so cleanly that detectives over the years became privately certain that he was the man who had taken her. They could not prove it, but the shape of it was right. The problem was time. By the time the pattern came clear, by the time genetic evidence was something detectives could use, by the time the science had caught up with the case, Angus Sinclair was an old man in a prison cell serving multiple life sentences for murders that he had been convicted of. The clock had run out on the kind of case building that could have linked him to Tricia. In 2019, Angus Sinclair died in prison. He was 84 years old. He never confessed to the murder of Tricia Black. He never said anything about her at all. Whatever he knew about what happened on the afternoon of October 9th, 1976, he took with him. Tricia's body has never been found. If you stand on the road in Irvine today, across from where the Turf Hotel used to be, you can still see the bus stop. It's not the same bus stop. The town has changed. The hotel itself has changed names and owners over the decades, but the location is the same. A bus still pulls up to that corner on Saturday afternoons. People still wait there. The road still runs down toward the river. The handbag is in an evidence locker. The twine is in an evidence locker. The stones are cataloged. Tricia's case is officially classified as unsolved. Her family, for almost 50 years, has lived with a version of grief that doesn't really have a name because there has never been a body to bury and there has never been a man in a courtroom to look at. What detectives believe happened, based on everything they pieced together over the years, is this. Tricia was standing at the bus stop, a car pulled up, the driver was somebody who either by appearance or by manner did not register to her as a threat. She got in or she was put in. Whatever happened after that happened fast, and it happened in a vehicle somewhere on the short drive between Irvine and the river. By the time darkness fell on the 9th of October, Tricia was gone, and her handbag was at the bottom of the River Irvine, wrapped in twine and stones, waiting to be found by a diver's hand in the dark water weeks later. From a grey river in the west of Scotland, where one woman vanished on a quiet Saturday and the killer cleaned up afterward with the calm of someone who had done it before, we're going to move halfway around the world now, to Tokyo, to the dead of winter a few months after Tricia disappeared, to a city of millions of people and a killer who didn't pick a single victim at all, a killer who left the bait on a shelf and waited to see who would pick it up. On a cold January evening in 1977, in the Shinagawa district of Tokyo, a 17-year-old factory worker named Kunio Daikoji was making his way home after a long shift. He was tired, his coat was damp from the night air, and he was walking the same route he walked every evening. A short walk down a side street, past the same shops, past the same small businesses, past a public telephone booth that sat on the corner the way it always did. Tokyo, in the middle of 1977, was a city of about 11 million people, and on any given evening, the streets near the train stations were full of office workers heading home and shopkeepers closing up. The neighborhood where Kunio walked that night was not unusual in any way. It was a quiet residential street, mostly empty after dark, with the soft hum of vending machines and the occasional sound of a train in the distance. Kunio was a high school student during the day, but he worked evening shifts at a factory to help his family. His route home that night took him past a telephone booth on the corner of a small intersection. The booth was the standard kind. Glass on 3 sides, a folding door on the front, a single phone mounted on the back wall, and a small ledge below the phone where people sometimes set things down while they were talking. As Kunio walked past the booth, something on the ledge caught his eye. A glass bottle of Coca-Cola, full the cap, still on. It was sitting upright on the shelf, perfectly placed, as if someone had stepped into the booth, set the bottle down to make a phone call, and then walked off without it. The label was clean, the seal looked untouched. It looked in every way like a bottle of Coca-Cola that somebody had just bought and then forgotten. Now, in Tokyo in the late 1970s, this was not a strange thing to find. People left things in phone booths all the time: umbrellas, newspapers, lighters. A bottle of soda sitting on the ledge of a phone booth at night was the kind of thing a tired teenager walking home from a long shift might glance again and then decide was a small gift from the universe. Kunio stepped into the booth. He picked up the bottle, he turned it in his hand and looked at the cap, which seemed sealed. He twisted it off, and the seal broke the way it would on any new bottle. He raised it to his mouth and took a long swallow. He didn't make it more than a few steps from the booth before he collapsed on the sidewalk. A passerby saw him fall and ran to him. The man knelt down. Kunio was conscious for a moment, trying to speak, but his body had already started to convulse. Whatever was happening to him was happening fast. The passerby ran for help. By the time an ambulance reached the scene, Kunio was unresponsive. He was rushed to a hospital, but there was nothing the doctors could do. He died within the hour. The cause of death, the medical examiner determined the next morning, was acute cyanide poisoning, a massive dose. The kind of dose that once it's in the bloodstream doesn't give the body time to do anything about it. The detectives who came to the scene that night had to work backward from the body. What had he eaten? What had he drunk? Where had he been? And somewhere in the early hours of that investigation, somebody asked about the bottle. The bottle was found on the sidewalk near where Kunio had fallen. It was tested. The Coca-Cola inside had been laced with potassium cyanide. The cap, which had appeared sealed, had been carefully removed at some point earlier, the poison added, and the cap put back on so neatly that a tired teenager looking at it in a phone booth would have no reason to think anything was wrong with it. The detectives in Tokyo had a problem on their hands that they had never really seen before. Somebody had left a poisoned bottle in a public place, not for a specific person. Just left it sitting on a shelf, waiting for whoever happened to walk by. There was no target. There was no motive that connected to the victim. Kunio had been picked by the bottle, not by the killer. Whoever the killer was, they had never met him. And then, less than 24 hours later, it happened again. A few kilometers away, in a different part of Tokyo, a 46-year-old man named Hiroyuki Sugiyama was walking near a train station when he noticed a bottle of Coca-Cola sitting by the side of the road. Same kind of bottle, same sealed-looking cap, same casual placement as if somebody had just set it down and walked away. He bent down, picked it up, and took it home. When he got home, he opened the bottle, he took a sip, and within minutes, he too was on the floor of his own apartment, dying of cyanide poisoning. His family called for help, the ambulance came. He didn't survive the trip to the hospital. By the next morning, Tokyo had 2 dead bodies, 2 poisoned Coca-Cola bottles, and a problem that was about to become one of the largest investigations in the history of the Japanese police. Because if there were 2 bottles, there might be 3, or 10, or 50. Nobody knew how many of these things were out there. Nobody knew if the killer was finished or just getting started. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police pulled in every available officer. They started a citywide sweep. Officers walked through every public space they could think of, checking telephone booths, checking vending machine areas, checking the small ledges and corners of train stations, looking for any unattended bottle of anything. Public service announcements went out across radio and television telling people in plain language, do not pick up bottles you find in public places. The fear that moved through Tokyo in those first few days was unlike anything the city had felt before. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from a specific killer with a specific pattern. It was the fear of randomness. The fear that the threat had no face, no preference, no method beyond placing a bottle on a shelf and waiting. The killer didn't have to be anywhere near the victim. The killer could be home in bed when the victim died. Investigators worked the bottles themselves. The cyanide was traced as far as it could be traced to industrial sources. Many factories in Japan in 1977 used potassium cyanide in their processes. The substance was not easy to get if you weren't in one of those industries, but it wasn't impossible either. Detectives started building lists of every person in the greater Tokyo area who would have had access. That list, by the end, ran into the thousands. They studied the bottles. They studied how the caps had been removed and replaced. They studied the placement of where the bottles had been left. Both bottles had been set down in spots that maximized the chance that an ordinary person walking past would notice them and pick them up. Not hidden, not thrown away, placed, like an offering, like bait. And then, just as the case was settling into a long, grinding investigation, a new development arrived. Not in Tokyo, in Osaka. In early February of 1977, several weeks after the Tokyo deaths, boxes of chocolates began appearing in public places around Osaka. Train stations, park benches, the kind of small gift boxes that in 1970s Japan were extremely common. Wrapped, presentable, the kind of thing you might assume somebody had dropped on their way home from work. Some of the boxes were picked up, some were opened, some of the chocolates inside were tested. They were laced with cyanide. Whoever was doing this had escalated or expanded. The same modus operandi, but in a new city with a new method. And then, attached to one of the boxes, investigators found something they had not seen before. A note, typed on a small piece of paper, stamped at the top with a rubber stamp. The note mocked the Japanese people. It called them proud and ugly. It did not give a name, it did not give a demand, it just taunted. This changed the case entirely. Now there was a voice. Now there was personality. Now there was the suggestion of motive, even if the motive was incoherent. The detectives in Osaka and Tokyo started comparing notes. The same person was almost certainly responsible for both the bottles and the chocolates, but the note, instead of helping them narrow the search, opened it up. Because now they were not just looking for a poisoner, they were looking for somebody with a grievance large enough to murder strangers about it. The investigation went on for years. The detectives analyzed the rubber stamp on the note. They identified the manufacturer. They traced where that particular stamp had been sold. They studied the typewriter used to type the message. They studied the handwriting on the addresses of any related materials. They built psychological profiles. They monitored public spaces. They followed thousands of tips from the public. None of it ever closed in on a single person. The bottles stopped. The chocolates stopped. After a few weeks, the wave of poisonings simply ended with no announcement, no final note, no resolution. Whoever the killer was, they had made their point, whatever the point had been, and they had stopped. Some investigators believed the killer had been frightened by the scale of the response. Some believed the killer had finished what they had set out to do. Some believed the killer had simply died of natural causes at some point in the years that followed. In Japan in 1977, the statute of limitations on murder was 15 years, which meant that by 1992, even if the killer was identified, they could no longer be prosecuted. The clock ran out. The case is now legally closed in the sense that no one can ever be charged for it. It remains open in the sense that no one has ever been named. What investigators came to believe is that the killer was almost certainly one person working alone with access to industrial-grade cyanide, with a working knowledge of how to remove and replace bottle caps, and with a grievance against society broad enough and abstract enough that the specific victims simply did not matter. The bottles were the message, the chocolates were the message, Kunio Daikoji and Hiroyuki Sugiyama and the others who survived but were poisoned were not chosen. They were just the people who reached out their hand. Tokyo changed after that winter. Vending machines were redesigned, bottles started being sold with tamper-evident seals. The casual habit of picking up an unattended drink from a public space disappeared overnight and never came back. Parents told their children, companies told their employees. The case became one of those events that quietly rewrote the rules of how an entire country interacted with its own public space. To this day, the killer has never been identified. From a winter in Tokyo, where the danger sat openly on a shelf and the victims chose themselves, the next trail leads to somewhere much colder and much quieter. A small college campus in rural Quebec in the autumn of 1978, A young woman who walked out of her dormitory one night and did not come back, and a family who would spend the next 30 years being told over and over that nothing was wrong until the spring thaw made it impossible to keep saying so. It's the evening of November 3rd, 1978. The campus of Champlain Regional College in the small town of Lennoxville in the eastern townships of Quebec. A 19-year-old student named Teresa Allure is in her dormitory room getting ready to head out for the night. She tells a friend down the hall that she'll be back later. She picks up her keys. She closes the door behind her. That door closing is the last confirmed moment anyone in Teresa's life can point to. After that, the trail goes dark. Teresa was a first-year student. She had grown up in North Carolina and in Ontario, the daughter of a family that moved around for her father's career. She was 19 years old. She was bright, quiet, a little reserved, the kind of student who showed up to class and did the work without making a fuss about it. She had been at Champlain for only a few months when she disappeared. Lennoxville in early November is a place that has already given up on autumn. The leaves are mostly down, the temperature drops below freezing at night. The campus sits in a rural part of Quebec, surrounded by fields and backroads and small woods, the kind of landscape that looks beautiful in the daytime and turns into a wall of black after sunset. The college residence where Teresa lived was a converted convent a few kilometers from the main campus. That night, when Teresa didn't come back to her room, none of her friends thought much of it. College students stay out, they sleep at a friend's place, they go home for a long weekend without telling everyone. The first day, she was missing, no alarm bells went off. The second day, people started to notice. By the third day, her friends had begun asking around. By the end of the week, somebody finally called her parents. Her parents, Bob and Yvonne Allure, drove up to Lennoxville from where they were living at the time. They went to the school, they went to the residence, they asked the administration to call the police. And what they ran into almost immediately was a wall. The administrators at the college told them gently but firmly that Teresa had probably just run away. College stress. First year away from home. A lot of students did this. She would turn up in a few days, embarrassed, and everything would be fine. The local police, when they were finally brought into the picture, gave the family essentially the same answer. Young woman, probably ran off, probably with a boyfriend, probably will be back. Bob Allure did not believe them. He knew his daughter. Teresa was not the kind of person who would vanish without telling anyone. She was not in a fight with her family. She had not been struggling at school in the way the administrators suggested. She had no boyfriend that anybody knew about, and she had left her belongings in her dorm room. Her books, her clothes, her wallet. But the family was told over and over by the school and by the police to wait, to give it time, to trust that she would come back on her own. There was no real search. There was no canvassing of the surrounding fields. There were no police divers in the small river that ran near the residence. There was no investigation in any meaningful sense of the word. The official position was that Teresa Allure was a runaway, and runaways are not crime victims. So the family waited, and the winter came down on Quebec the way it does, hard and complete, and the fields around the residence froze under a meter of snow, and the back roads turned white, and the small drainage ditches along those roads filled up with ice. Whatever had happened to Teresa was now buried under the season itself. Nothing was going to surface until spring. Months passed. November turned into December. Christmas came and went without her. January, February, March. The family kept calling. The school kept telling them the same thing. The police kept telling them the same thing. Bob Allure would later describe that winter as a kind of slow drowning where everyone around him kept insisting that nothing was wrong while he knew in a place beyond argument that something was very wrong. In early April of 1979, 5 months after Teresa had walked out of her dorm room, the snow in the eastern townships started to thaw. The fields softened. The drainage ditches along the back roads began to open up. The ice receded. And on one of those back roads, a few kilometers from the Champlain residence, a passerby looked into one of those ditches and saw something that should not have been there. It was a body, face down, in the shallow water at the bottom of the ditch, wearing almost no clothing. The police came out. They identified the body within a short time. It was Teresa. The ditch where she was found was less than 2 kilometers from the residence she had walked out of in November. 2 kilometers. In a straight line, you could almost see one from the other on a clear day. For 5 months, while her family had been told she was a runaway, while the police had been telling them to be patient, her body had been lying in a ditch beside a road that any officer doing even the most basic search would have driven past. What happened next compounded the failure. The initial investigation of the body and the scene was, by any modern standard, badly handled. The crime scene was not properly secured for long enough, evidence was lost. The autopsy, when it was performed, did not include the kind of detailed analysis that would have given investigators much to work with. And then, before the family even had time to bury their daughter, the police floated a theory that hit Bob and Yvonne Allure like a second loss. The theory was that Teresa had died of a drug overdose, that she had been at some kind of party, that she had wandered out, gotten lost, and died in the ditch from exposure after taking something, that her partial state of dress was consistent with the kind of disorientation that drugs could cause. There was no evidence for any of this. None. Teresa had no history of drug use. There was no witness who placed her at any party that night. There were no drugs found in her dorm room. There were no drugs found in her belongings. The autopsy did not confirm an overdose in any conclusive way. The theory existed because it was a tidy explanation, and tidy explanations have a way of becoming the official version when nobody wants to do the hard work of looking deeper. Bob and Yvonne buried their daughter. The case was officially listed as a death of undetermined cause, not a homicide, not even a suspicious death in the way the police chose to describe it. Just a young woman who had died in a ditch in circumstances they declined to investigate further. The file was closed in everything but name. Years went by, then a decade, then 2. Teresa's older brother, John Allure, grew up. He went to school, he started a career, he had children of his own, and the whole time in the back of his mind, there was the case of his sister. The official version of what had happened to her had never sat right with him or with his parents, and as he got older, he started to push back on it. Not with anger, with research. In the early 2000s, more than 20 years after Teresa's death, John Allure started doing what the police should have done in 1978. He pulled records. He talked to former students from Champlain. He talked to former staff. He talked to journalists in Quebec. He started building piece by piece his own picture of what had been happening in the eastern townships in the late 1970s. What he found shook the family all over again. Teresa, it turned out, was not the only young woman in that region who had died or disappeared under strange circumstances in the late 1970s. There were others, several others. Young women roughly the same age range, found in similar conditions, in similar landscapes, often in ditches or wooded areas, often dismissed at the time as runaways or overdoses or accidents. Cases that, when you laid them out side by side, started to look uncomfortably like a pattern. The geography lined up, the timing lined up, the victim profile lined up, and the response from local authorities had been roughly the same in every case. A quick conclusion, a soft dismissal, a closed file. What John Allure came to believe, and what investigators who eventually took the cases seriously came to believe with him, is that the late 1970s in the eastern townships of Quebec had been the hunting ground of one or more predatory killers operating in a region where the police were not looking, and where each death was treated as an isolated incident rather than as part of anything larger. Teresa's case had not been a single failure. It had been part of a system of failures, repeated case after case. The Sûreté du Québec eventually reopened the file. Teresa Allure's death was reclassified. It was no longer treated as undetermined. It was treated finally as what her family had said it was from the very first week, a homicide. Decades after she had been buried, the official designation matched the truth. But by then, the trail was nearly 50 years cold. The crime scene was long gone, the witnesses were elderly or dead, the physical evidence that might have led to a suspect had been lost in the original mishandling. The killer, whoever he was, had had decades to disappear, to move, to die quietly in some other province under some other name. John Allure co-hosted a podcast about his sister's case and the other cases connected to it. He wrote about them. He kept the pressure on. He turned a family's grief into a long, slow, public investigation that has even now not produced an arrest. But it has produced something else. It has produced a record. It has produced a refusal to let the cases be quietly forgotten the way they almost were. Teresa Allor's case today is officially classified as an unsolved homicide. The Sûreté du Québec has it on its cold case registry. The Allor family, what's left of them after the decades, still pushes for the case to be looked at every few years by a new generation of investigators. What likely happened in the broad strokes that investigators have been able to reconstruct is this. Teresa left her dormitory on the evening of November 3, 1978. She did not get far. Somewhere in the short distance between the residence and wherever she had been planning to go, someone intercepted her. Whether she got into a vehicle, whether she was pulled into one, whether she was attacked on the road itself, no one will ever know for sure. Within hours, she was dead. Her body was placed in a drainage ditch 2 kilometers from where she had started. And then winter came down on Quebec and the snow covered everything. And for 5 months, while her family was told to wait, she was right there the entire time within a short drive of the police station that was telling them not to worry. From a frozen field in Quebec, where the season itself helped a killer hide, and the people in charge helped him even more, the next trail leads to a stretch of West German highway in the spring of 1977. A bright yellow delivery van, a familiar route, and a group of men standing in the road in uniforms that at a glance looked exactly like the ones they were supposed to be. From a stretch of West German highway, where a uniform and a checkpoint were all it took to stop a man in the middle of his ordinary workday, the next trail leads to somewhere warmer, brighter, and far more exposed. To Rio de Janeiro in the summer of 1977. To a young woman from a wealthy family, a party in one of the city's most beautiful neighborhoods, and a worker on a cliffside who happened to be looking out at the road at exactly the wrong moment. It's the late evening of July 23, 1977, in the Leblon district of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Inside a luxury apartment high above the streets, a party is in full motion. The lights are warm, the music is loud enough to carry out onto the balcony. A 21-year-old woman named Claudia Lesson Rodriguez is somewhere inside the apartment, surrounded by people her own age and people much older than her, all of them moving through rooms that look out over the lights of one of the most beautiful coastlines in the world. Claudia came from an upper-middle-class family in Rio. Her father was a respected figure in the city's professional class, and the family lived the kind of life that put Claudia in the same social circles as the children of the very wealthy. She was 21 years old, slim, with long dark hair, the kind of young woman whose photograph would later run on the front page of every newspaper in Brazil. She was also, by the accounts of those closest to her, dealing with a quiet depression that her family had been trying to help her through. That summer, the social scene in Leblon was at the center of everything that mattered in Rio. The neighborhood sits between the mountains and the Atlantic. And in 1977, it was where the city's young heirs and their friends gathered in the kind of apartments that had marble floors and balconies that ran the length of the building. Claudia moved in those circles. She knew the people who threw the parties. She had been to apartments like this one many times before. On the night of July 23rd, she went to one of those parties. She had told her family she was going out. She had not given them a specific address. She had not given them a time she would be home. That was not unusual for a 21-year-old in Rio in that era, and it would not have raised any concern at all if she had simply walked through her own front door later that night the way she had on 100 nights before. But she did not walk through her own front door later that night. Somewhere inside that apartment in Leblon, in the hours between the party reaching its peak and the city's first light, something went wrong. Exactly what happened inside those rooms, who was there, who saw what, who did what, would become one of the most fiercely disputed questions in the history of Brazilian crime journalism. The version that the investigators would eventually piece together is this. Claudia was assaulted inside the apartment. By the time the assault was over, she was dead. What happened next was not panic, it was a decision. The people inside that apartment, or at least 2 of them, agreed on a plan. They wrapped her body, they carried it down through the building out to a vehicle in the street, and they put her in the car. And then, in the very early hours of the morning, they drove the car along Avenida Niemeyer, the scenic road that hugs the cliffs above the ocean between LeBlanc and the neighborhoods to the south, looking for a stretch where the road was empty and the rocks below were steep enough to do the job. About halfway along that road, on the cliffside above the water, there was a small wooden structure, the kind of shack where a laborer might sleep at night while working on a stretch of nearby property. Inside the shack, in the very early hours of July 25th, a worker was awake. He could not say later exactly why he had been awake. He had heard a car, he had looked out toward the road, and what he saw through the small window of his shack was enough to make him sit up. A luxury car had stopped on the road above. Two men had gotten out. They had walked around to the back of the vehicle, they had opened it, and then between them, they had carried something heavy, wrapped in something that looked like a cloth or a sheet, to the edge of the road. The worker watched as the two men lifted the bundle, swung it once, and threw it over the side of the cliff into the rocks below. Then they got back into the car and drove off. The worker stayed where he was for a long moment. He did not understand exactly what he had just seen, but he understood that it was bad. He had also, in the seconds before the car drove away, been close enough to read the license plate. He memorized the number. He did not go to the police directly. What he did instead, the next morning, was call a Rio radio station that was known for receiving anonymous tips from listeners. He gave them the license plate. He told them what he had seen. That phone call would turn out to be one of the most important moments in Brazilian crime journalism in the entire decade. Within a day, Claudia's body was found. A passerby on the rocks below Avenida Niemeyer spotted something that did not belong, and the police were called in. When they reached the body, they found a young woman with no clothing on, wedged into the coastal rocks where the surf was breaking against the cliff. The investigation was opened immediately. Within hours, detectives in Rio had been given the license plate number from the radio station tip, and they ran it. The plate belonged to a vehicle registered to one of the most recognizable names in Brazilian high society. The owner of the car was a young man named Michel Frank. Michel Frank was the heir to the Swiss-Brazilian fortune behind the Mondaine Watch Company, a name that meant money, influence, and a level of social access in Rio that ordinary investigations did not usually touch. Michel Frank was 25 years old, and on the night of the party, he had been one of the people inside the apartment in LeBlanc. The second man the investigators would soon determine was a well-known figure in Rio's celebrity scene, a hairstylist named Georges Cour, who moved between the apartments and the salons of the city's most photographed families. Cour and Frank had been seen at the party together. The license plate belonged to a vehicle they had been using that night. The pieces of the case in those first few days came together fast. And then the case ran straight into the wall that in Brazil in 1977 was always going to be there. Wealth, connection. The kind of family relationships that in a country where the courts moved slowly and the press could be pressured made certain people much harder to prosecute than others. The investigation continued, but it began to bend. Michel Frank, while the case was still in its early stages, left the country. He flew to Switzerland, the country his family was connected to, where the question of whether he could be extradited back to Brazil to face charges became a long and slow legal battle that would never reach a clean resolution. He stayed in Switzerland. He lived his life. He was, for all practical purposes, beyond the reach of the Brazilian courts for as long as he was willing to stay where he was. Georges Cour, the second man, did not flee. He stayed in Rio and he faced the legal system, and over the years of the proceedings that followed the case against him kept shifting. The prosecution that initially built around the murder itself was narrowed and narrowed until what was left was a much smaller charge. Cour was eventually convicted, but not of killing Claudia. He was convicted of concealing her body. He served a sentence for that, and that was the only conviction the case ever produced. In Brazilian journalism, the case became something larger than itself. The reporting on the Caso Claudia, particularly the long investigative work done by the magazine Veja, won a major journalism prize and became one of the defining pieces of reporting of the late 1970s in Brazil. The reporters laid out, with the names and the documents and the photographs, the way the case had been bent by the people involved. They named the families, they named the lawyers, they named the moves. The general public in Rio and across Brazil understood very quickly what had happened. A young woman had been killed in a luxury apartment by people who had been able to use their money and their connections to walk away from it. One had fled the country. The other had served time for moving the body, but not for the death itself. The case became a kind of shorthand in Brazilian conversation for what happened when the law met the wealthy and what came out the other side. And then, 12 years after Claudia's death, something happened that closed the case in a way no court ever would have. In 1989, Michel Frank, still living his life in Switzerland, was shot and killed. The circumstances of his death were murky and contested. There were reports that it had happened in a private setting. There were reports that it was related to a personal dispute. There were reports that it was something else entirely. What was not in dispute is that he was dead, that he was 44 years old, and that whatever questions remained about what had happened in that apartment in Leblon on the night of July 23, 1977, he was no longer alive to answer them. What investigators believe happened in that apartment, based on the witnesses, the physical evidence, and the reporting that followed, is roughly this. Claudia attended the party. At some point during the night, she was alone in a room with one or both of the men. She was assaulted. The assault turned fatal. The two men, faced with the body of a young woman from a well-known family inside an apartment that they could be traced to, made the decision to dispose of her rather than to call for help. They wrapped her. They carried her down to the car. They drove her along Avenida Niemeyer. And they threw her off the cliff. What they had not counted on was that on a stretch of road they had assumed was empty in the very early hours of the morning, a man in a wooden shack was awake, was looking, and was within reading distance of their license plate. The case of Claudia Lessin Rodriguez today is officially listed as partially resolved, with one conviction for concealment of a corpse and no conviction for the homicide itself. The apartment in Leblon is still standing. Avenida Niemeyer still runs along the cliffs. The stretch of rocks where her body was found is still there, the surf still breaking against them. Her family buried her in 1977, and the case has, in every legal sense that matters, was been over for decades, with the truth of what happened that night, sitting just outside the reach of the courts that should have caught it. From a cliffside in Rio, where a witness in a wooden shack helped surface a truth that the courts could not finish the next trail, leads to a quiet terrace house in Melbourne on a hot January morning in the same year. To two young women, a 16-month-old child, a slightly open front door, and a silence that would last for almost 50 years before forensic science finally caught up with the man who had walked out of that house. It's the early afternoon of January 13th, 1977, on a quiet residential street in the suburb of Collingwood in Melbourne, Australia. A neighbor is walking past a row of narrow Victorian terrace houses when she notices something small and out of place. A dog on the front porch of one of the houses, whining softly at the door. The door itself is not fully closed. It is sitting slightly open, just a thin gap, the kind of gap you don't leave on a hot Melbourne afternoon. The street was Easy Street. The house was a rental terrace, one of those tall, narrow buildings that run straight back from the footpath joined to the houses on either side. Two young women lived in that terrace together, sharing the rooms and the rent and the small backyard. Their names were Suzanne Armstrong, who was 27, and Susan Bartlett, who was 28. They were close friends, the kind of friends who had decided to make a household together. Suzanne Armstrong had a 16-month-old son named Gregory. He lived in the house with her. He had a cot in one of the rooms upstairs, and his routines, his bottles, his small clothes were part of the everyday rhythm of the household. Suzanne was a young mother working out the early years of raising a child, and Susan was the steady friend who lived alongside her through it. The two women had built a life inside that terrace that was unremarkable in the best possible way. Collingwood in 1977 was not a wealthy suburb. It was working class, close to the city center, the kind of neighborhood where the terrace houses had been built 100 years earlier and were now rented by young people trying to make their way. The street was busy during the day with people walking to the tram stop and going to work, and quiet at night, the way a residential street in inner Melbourne always settled down once the sun went over the rooftops. On the afternoon of Sunday, the 9th of January, 4 days before the neighbor noticed the dogs Suzanne and Susan had both been seen alive by people who knew them. They had been at home. They had been doing the ordinary things you do on a Sunday in summer in Melbourne. By the next morning, neither of them was answering their phone, and neither of them was responding to the calls of friends who were trying to reach them. But none of those friends thought at the time to walk over to the house and knock on the door. Across the next 3 days, the household on Easy Street went silent. The phone rang and rang. Letters arrived and were not collected from the box. The lights in the front rooms, which were usually visible from the street at night, did not come on. People who passed the house did not notice anything specifically wrong because nothing was specifically wrong on the outside. The terrace looked the way it always looked. The curtains were drawn. The dog was inside. What no one on the street knew across those 3 days was that inside the upstairs rooms, Gregory was alive in his cot, 16 months old, alone in the house. His mother was in the next room. His mother's best friend was in another. Both of them had been dead since Sunday night. Gregory could not climb out of the cot. He could not reach a phone. He could not open the front door. All he could do was cry, and then stop crying, and then start again, and then go quiet for long stretches when his small body simply ran out of strength. He was in the house with the dog. The dog had been moving between the rooms during those 3 days, and at some point during those 3 days, the dog had nudged its way out through the front door, which had not been fully closed by whoever had left the house last. The dog kept coming back to the porch, the dog kept whining at the door, and on that Thursday afternoon, the neighbor walking past finally stopped to look at what the dog was trying to tell her. She walked up onto the porch, she pushed the door open, she called out into the house. There was no answer. She stepped into the hallway, and within a few seconds of being inside, she understood that something was very wrong. She did not go upstairs. She did not need to. She turned around, walked back out the front door, and went to find a phone. The police arrived at Easy Street within the hour. What they found inside the terrace was a crime scene that, even by the standards of the Melbourne Homicide Squad in the 1970s, was extreme. Suzanne Armstrong was upstairs. She had been stabbed. The wounds were extensive. Susan Bartlett was also upstairs in another part of the house, and she had been stabbed as well, just as savagely. Both women had been dead since Sunday night, the medical examiner would later determine. And in the cot in the upstairs room near his mother, Gregory was still alive. He was severely dehydrated. He had been in the same clothes for days. He had not been fed since Sunday. He was so weak by the time the police lifted him out of the cot that he could barely move. He was rushed to a hospital in Melbourne. The doctors who treated him said later that he had been very close to the edge. A few more hours, a longer wait by the neighbor, a different turn of events with the dog, and the case at Easy Street would have had 3 victims instead of 2. Gregory survived. The dog survived. The 2 women did not. The investigation that opened in those first days was one of the largest in Victorian police history. The terrace was sealed, forensic teams worked through every room, detectives canvassed Collingwood door by door. They interviewed everyone who had known Suzanne or Susan, everyone who had visited the house, everyone who had any reason to have been on that street on the night of January 9th. They built a list of persons of interest that ran into the hundreds and then into the thousands as the years went on. The medical examiner determined that both women had been attacked late on Sunday night. There was no sign that the front door had been forced. Either the killer had been let in or the door had been unlocked, which on a hot summer night in 1977 in inner Melbourne was not unusual. Whoever had come into that house had attacked both women within a relatively short window of time, had done what they came to do, and had walked out the front door without bothering to close it properly behind them. The case was, in those first weeks, the biggest story in Melbourne. The image of the 2 young women inside the terrace with the small child crying in the cot for 3 days became the kind of detail that does not leave a city's memory. Parents looked at their own front doors differently. Young women living together in share houses started locking up at night. The fear that came out of Easy Street rippled across inner Melbourne for years. But the investigation, despite the scale of it, did not produce an arrest. The detectives had physical evidence from the scene, including biological material that they preserved carefully, even though in 1977, the science to do anything with it did not yet exist. They had statements from neighbors, statements from friends, statements from people who had been in the area that weekend. They had a list of names. What they did not have was a match between any of those names and the evidence on the bodies. The years went by, then the decades. The case stayed open. It was never officially closed, never moved into a category that would have allowed it to be quietly shelved. Detectives in Victoria worked the file across multiple generations of the homicide squad. Whenever a new technique in forensic science came along, the Easy Street evidence was brought back out and tested against it. Across the 1980s, then the 90s, then the 2000s, the science kept improving. The match did not come. Gregory, the boy in the cot, grew up. He was raised by Suzanne's family. He carried the case with him for his entire life in the way that survivors of these things have to. He was 16 months old when his mother was killed in the next room, which meant that he had no real memory of her, only the photographs and the stories. The case of his mother was the central fact of his existence, and for decades it was a case that had no ending. Then, in the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, a technique called forensic genetic genealogy started to change what was possible in cases like Easy Street. The technique works by taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and comparing it not to a single criminal database, but to the much larger genetic databases that ordinary people use when they send their saliva to ancestry companies. The match doesn't have to be the killer. The match can be a cousin, a second cousin, someone 3 branches up the family tree. From there, investigators can build the tree downward and find the person they are actually looking for. The Victoria Police Homicide Squad started running the Easy Street DNA through these databases. They built a family tree. Slowly, across years of work, the tree pointed toward a single living person. A man in his 60s, originally Australian, living overseas. With no significant criminal record in the decades since 1977, just the quiet life of an ordinary older man somewhere in Europe. In late 2024, almost 48 years after the murders, the Victoria Police, working with international authorities, moved on him. The arrest happened at an airport in Rome. The man, 65 years old at the time of the arrest, was intercepted by Italian authorities and taken into custody. The charge was the murder of Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett in Collingwood, Melbourne on the 9th of January, 1977. For Gregory, who was by then a man in his late 40s, the arrest was the moment that the central fact of his life finally moved. The case that had defined every year since he had been lifted out of that cot. The case that his grandparents had carried, that his extended family had carried, that an entire city had carried, had a name attached to it. The legal proceedings would take their own time after that. Extradition, charges, trial. But the long silence was over. What investigators believe happened in the terrace on Easy Street, based on the evidence and the reconstruction, is this. Sometime late on Sunday night, the 9th of January, the killer came to the front door of the house. Whether he knocked, whether he was let in, whether the door was simply unlocked, no one can say with full certainty. What is certain is that within a short time of him being inside that house, both Suzanne and Susan were attacked and both were dead. He walked back out into the warm Melbourne night and pulled the door behind him, but not all the way. Gregory was in his cot the entire time. The dog was in the house the entire time. And for 3 days and 3 nights, in a quiet inner-city suburb, in a terrace that looked from the outside exactly like every other terrace on the street, that child and that dog were the only 2 living things inside, while their world went silent around them. 6 stories tonight from 6 different parts of the world across 5 different decades. A 6-year-old in a Connecticut subdivision, a young woman at a bus stop in Scotland, a teenager picking up a bottle in Tokyo, a college student in Quebec, a heiress in Rio, 2 friends in a Melbourne terrace with a 16-month-old child surviving in a cot beside them. Different countries, different languages, different decades. And yet, if you sit with them for a while, you start to notice that they are all telling you the same few things. The first thing they tell you is that almost every one of these stories started inside an ordinary day. None of these victims woke up that morning expecting anything to be wrong. Renee Freer asked her mother if she could go outside to play the same way she had asked 100 times before. Patricia Black finished her tea and announced she was going shopping. Kunio Daikoji was walking home from a long shift on the same street he walked every night. Teresa Allure was getting ready to go out, Claudia Lesson Rodriguez was going to a party, Suzanne Armstrong and Susan Bartlett were in their own house on a hot summer night. That is the part that does not leave you if you let yourself sit with it honestly. The lives that ended in these cases were not lives that had drifted into some special category of danger. They were not adventurers. They were not careless. They were not in the wrong place in any sense that they themselves could have recognized in the moment. They were inside the most ordinary moments of their own ordinary days. And that is the truth of almost every case like this. The threat does not usually arrive in the form that we have been told to look for. The threat arrives inside the day we did not think twice about. The second thing these stories tell you is that the most dangerous figure in most of them is not the obvious stranger from the highway. It is the person who already knows the layout. In Renee Freer's case, the killer was almost certainly someone who could move through that subdivision and through those woods without being noticed, because nobody on that street had any reason to notice him. In the Easy Street murders, the killer walked into a house that did not require him to break in. In Claudia's case, the danger was inside the apartment she had been invited to among the people she had been laughing with. There is a tendency when we talk about safety to imagine the threat as something coming from far away. The drifter, the outsider, the stranger from somewhere else. The cases tonight lined up next to each other push back hard against that picture. Most violence in most lives in most places comes from somewhere close. From a neighbor, an acquaintance, a friend of a friend. A person who has been on the edge of the social circle long enough that nobody really questions their presence anymore. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is true. The third thing, and maybe the heaviest, is what these stories tell you about how the systems around victims respond when something goes wrong. Teresa Allure's family spent 5 months being told that their daughter had probably just run away while her body lay in a ditch less than 2 kilometers from her dormitory. The caso Claudia turned in the courts into a conviction for concealment of a body and nothing for the killing itself, because the people involved had the money and the connections to bend the case around themselves. In the cyanide cola murders, the statute of limitations ran out before anyone was ever named. In Renee Freer's case, the killer was almost certainly at the search and almost certainly came to the funeral and was almost certainly someone who waved at the family for years afterward, and nobody ever said his name out loud. Justice in real life is not the clean thing it is in stories. It does not arrive on schedule. It does not always arrive at all. Sometimes the case is solved by a forensic technique that did not exist when the crime happened, and the answer comes 48 years later at an airport in Rome. Sometimes the answer never comes, and the file just sits on a desk, and the road outside the family's house keeps running past, and life goes on around the silence. Sitting with these cases honestly means sitting with the fact that not every story gets its ending, and that the absence of an ending is itself a kind of weight that families carry for the rest of their lives. The fourth thing is the role of small details. The dog whining at the door on Easy Street, the license plate that a worker on a cliffside memorized at 4 in the morning, the handbag that a diver's hand closed around in the dark water of the River Irvine. The drainage ditch that the spring thaw finally uncovered. In almost every one of these cases, what eventually moved the truth or partly moved it was something small that almost did not get noticed. A neighbor who looked twice at a porch. A man in a wooden shack who happened to be awake at the wrong hour and the right one. A diver whose glove brushed against something that wasn't a stone. If there is a quiet lesson in that, it is this: pay attention to the door that should not be open, to the car that has been parked too long on a street where it does not belong, to the friend who is not answering when she always answers, to the child you have not heard from in too many hours. Most of the time, the thing you notice will turn out to be nothing, but the cost of paying attention to something that turns out to be nothing is small. And the cost of not paying attention to something that turns out to be real is everything. The neighbor on Easy Street, walking past on that hot January afternoon, is the reason Gregory survived. She did not know what she was about to find. She only knew that the door was open in a way that did not look right, and the dog was on the porch in a way that did not look right, and she chose to walk up the steps instead of past them. The fifth thing is what these stories tell you about love that does not stop. Bob and Yvonne Allor were told for 5 months that their daughter had run away, and they did not believe it, and they kept saying so. After Teresa was found, they were told it was an overdose, and they did not believe that either, and they kept saying so. John Allor took up that work after them, and he did not stop. And decades later, the case is finally being treated as what his family always said it was. The Freer family, half a century later, is still waiting for someone in that subdivision to say a name. The family of Patricia Black, what is left of them, is still living with the absence of a body that was never recovered. Gregory grew up carrying the memory of a mother he was too young to remember, raised by the people who refused to let her be forgotten. There is something in that which is in a quiet way the most important thing tonight. Love, the kind of love that families carry across decades, does not behave like a case file. It does not close. It does not move on. It keeps going year after year, long after the police have stopped calling and the newspapers have stopped writing. And that love, more than any forensic technique, more than any cold case unit, is what keeps these stories from disappearing into the kind of silence that most violence is buried under. The Allor podcast exists because of love. The pressure on the Easy Street case stayed alive across 48 years because of love. The $50,000 reward on Renee Freer's case is still on the table because of love. So what do you take from a night like this? Not fear, I would say. Fear is the easy response, but fear is also the response that does not serve you very well across the long run of a life. Fear tells you to lock everything and trust nothing, and that is not a way to live, and it is not even an effective way to be safe. The people in tonight's stories were not undone by a failure of fear. They were undone by other people's choices, and by systems that failed them, and by bad timing, and by the kind of moments that in most lives on most days simply do not happen. What you take, I think, is something quieter. You take a respect for the ordinary day. You take an awareness that the people you love are inside their ordinary days too, and that those days are precious in a way that is easy to forget when nothing is going wrong. You take a willingness to pay attention to the small thing that looks slightly off. You take a refusal to be the kind of person who would walk past a porch where a dog is whining at a door that should be closed. And you take maybe a small piece of what the families in these cases have carried for so long. The understanding that the dead are not just case numbers, and the missing are not just files, and the silence around an unsolved case is not just an inconvenience to the investigators. It is somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's friend who was supposed to be home for supper, somebody's son who survived in a cot for 3 days and then grew up into a man who every January knows exactly what day it is. Thank you for spending the evening with these stories. Take care of the people inside your ordinary days. They are the whole point.